Welcome to Leadership Daily. My name is Kyle Denton. I'm excited to kick off the first episode where we help coaches, consultants, educators, practitioners, and students to hone their leadership craft, especially in ed tech and entrepreneurship. Today, I wanted to talk about diversity and technology, especially virtual teams. One of my papers just submitted is about virtual team virtuality and how to be a team member as well as lead that team. My lens was culture, communication, and relationships within virtual teams, which is huge in the work from anywhere, work from home, work from everywhere culture that we have entered over the last 18 months. Overnight, we practically entered it, right? So one of the things that I'm starting to look at is what are some of those dark sides? What are some of those issues where we really need to recognize the gap and work on it, build a bridge? And diversity is one of those things with virtual teams that can be problematic, as well as with inclusion, because there's a gap, right? There's something that isn't effectively communicated over a virtual construct. A lot of this depends on the tool, and there's some ways to build the bridge to overcome that gap, right? And I was just listening to the Harvard Business Review article on Audible. That's one of my tech tips, right? You can learn so much capitalizing on time that's otherwise spent in mundanity, the including an individual versus including and having a diverse representation of groups. This is important. There's multiple identities that people can hold. It's not just that, I'm a white person. Like if you just included me with every single person ever and said we were the exact same, well, that's not fair. Same as having a diversity and inclusion class and there's one or two people of color in there and you call on them and be like, hey, tell us what it is for all people of color, right? What? No, they're an individual. Maybe they have an entirely different set of experiences. That prejudice right there, prejudging them, predisposing your beliefs that they fit into some bucket you already hold. That's super problematic. What's that look like in a virtual team? Also, the opposite happens. We forget that people are different, that they aren't like us. This can happen in different ways. Time zones are a huge issue. We forget about time super easy. We start sending messages and people aren't responding. Time zones are more problematic than you would be predisposed to recognizing. I've experienced this working with global virtual teams because even being cognizant of the time difference, we forget about the routines and how those time differences interact. There are peak time orbits where people are available. You can see this in marketing training too. Make sure to post at this time of the day because your market segment has their phones out at this time, like lunchtime, right after work, or right before bed. First thing in the morning can be for a certain group, for certain things, right? These are sort of optimal orbit points around the Earth. Don't quote me on that. I'm not an astronomer, astrophysicist, or anything like that. But these peak orbits, I'm going to use the term, where people naturally gravitate to certain activities. And, with time zones, like they don't match up. You may not have orbits that are in harmony. So I worked with a group that's in Munich and, here's the crazy thing. Like I'm going to bed at night. So they're typically 9 hours ahead. I'm going to bed at night and they're getting ready for the day. Okay. So I can either stay up late and capitalize on that first part of the day that's productive. Okay. But I need my sleep too. Or here's the thing. First thing when I wake up, so I'm waking up at 5 a.m. So was 2 p.m. So they're finishing up at work. They may have a little bit of free time in the natural 9 to 5 because That's still a pretty consistent schedule for the majority of knowledge workers, professional workers, students, government workers. So that's another little orbit you can capitalize on, that end of day slump where they're cognitively drained and they need a release. And then, of course, the after work, right before dinner, people catching up on some things. That's like 10 a.m. for me. That's like peak work time at my job. Doesn't work so well. That's when a lot of their conversations start happening at work, super focused, tons of people working on tons of things, meetings, presentations, training, not really able to engage. It's not until I hit my orbit, that end of day slump, where I can check out a few things, and it's late at night for them. So I may be able to get a couple messages in. After work, I'm getting off work at 1600. You add 9, that's 1 a.m. So they're asleep, unless they're out late. So maybe on a Friday night, I might be able to get a hold of them. But welcome to the pandemic world, because people go out late. I don't think bars exist anymore. That takes us to the next thing. So that was the issues with time zones and those natural orbitals around certain times of day based on common schedules. Not everybody fits in those schedules. The individual may have a different schedule. Ask what works for them if you're looking to set something up. That's another tech tip tool. Use a scheduling tool that allows bookings and provide a variety of booking options. Every country may be in a different place right now. That's one of the new realities with the pandemic world, that they may have an entirely different set of rules happening that are drastically different than what we would expect that happens. We can't assume that they're going out to work anywhere. Can't assume they're staying home. A lot of people stayed home for long periods of time, lockdown over the pandemic. Yeah, I didn't have that experience. Essential worker, national security. So I had to go to work every day at the place I work and do the things I do for national security. The roads were super clear, folks. That's my perception. Zero traffic. That's what I saw. Not a lot of people in the office, because one of the tasks I had to do was help get 3,000 people out on telework over a 2-week period. We hit the 2,000 mark rapidly. And then over the next couple months, we increased that number to over 7,000 telework folks. They all teleworked at different times, not 24/7 or 5 days a week or whatever. But yeah, each country, a little different place. Each person's experience a little different. So that diversity and inclusion is really important. Here's the general condition that a lot of people can relate to, but how do you make sure to represent the individual, recognize the individual more correctly, represent the broad category, recognize and include the individual? So that's huge. Now, with a virtual team, you don't necessarily have the ability to recognize the diversity. So you don't know whether you're hitting it or not. Like, unless you have visual elements, which Zoom, video chat, those help with that. Uploaded images, people smiling. I love those avatars. They're smiling at me every time I see them. I'm just like, oh, that's nice. It's weird, that cognitive effect that a smiling picture has when somebody's talking, even if they're not smiling. That's another little weak psychological thing there to recognize with virtual teams. The visual element, super important. Being able to see people, being able to see body language, gestures, motion. That's helpful for communication and relationships. The flip side of that, though, is we only have these limited time windows where we are on together. Like, meetings are the lifeblood of virtual teams, but we don't necessarily see the other habits or routines or things that may be associated with cultures, both good and bad. It limits our connection to others, our relationships, because once we're able to understand where an individual is coming from, we can also build to those strengths in our relationships. That's super fascinating. I would love to learn more about X, Y, or Z, about your identity and culture. That's important. People can belong to multiple cultures and hold multiple identities depending on the space they occupy at a certain time. Virtual teams, there's this disconnect, and how do you bridge that gap? Now, language is another one, especially if you're working Western European or other supranational groups where English is a primary language for interaction. You see this within business interacting with Eastern countries like China. They talk in English a lot, or you'll see another technology gap that might need to be bridged is with translation software. There is research out there showing that artificial intelligence, machine learning software that's trained off large data sets that's publicly available on the internet, like the GPT-3 protocol, like they are gender biased. For example, some of those language processing tool sets will translate a gender neutral language, a language that literally does not have a she or him. They just have the pronomial identifier, like for the pronoun of it, basically, which is he, she, it. And yet, when they translate to English, you'll see that they'll translate like the doctor, he went to work, or the nurse, she went to the hospital. Right there. A nurse is a she, a doctor is a he. Very gendered, and it could be the exact opposite, but that's what the natural language processing does. That's one of the problematic issues of artificial intelligence and machine learning that you see. They create gender bias in language, and those are becoming more common for global virtual teams. If you're on a global virtual team, that's problematic. Language is still problematic with any virtual team because communication. We use different words to mean the same thing all the time. If you're somebody who's in tech and you have a family member who likes to call you to troubleshoot issues all the time, you've dealt with this where they call and the thingamajigger is broken. I got to figure out what thingamajigger and how is it broken and whether it's actually broken or not and what the fix is. You start talking through to figure out what specifically are they referring to and what is it specifically doing when they do certain actions. That problem, when you remove the face-to-face element and when you remove the video element using asynchronous communications like chat, posts, email, other type of content interactions, task lists, for example, that are super common, you lose that real-time feedback on the language synchronicity, the similarity of the language. Are you meaning the same thing and can you report back? So those lags can be problematic, and there's typically a tendency to reduce the communicated content because it takes a lot to type a lot. It takes a lot to read a lot. You can use voice messages as an example. Still, you don't get the back and forth, but it's another level of richness. The voice and text or the voice and visual, leaving a visual voicemail, that's another level. There's certain ways you can overcome that gap. Language, both from intercultural aspects as well as with individual communication aspects, some things you have to bridge. There's a lot of things that are problematic with virtual teams, and there's this need to recognize them. We covered a couple, there's others as well. And that's one of the things that I'm excited to be exploring, because the issue is if you don't recognize those different identities, if you don't recognize the different strengths and differences that your team has, one, it's going to impact the communication. Two, it's going to impact your relationships. And three, your individual team culture is going to be less connected, less engaged. And that can be problematic because what happens when the team isn't synchronized? You start getting inefficiencies, gaps, friction, things that reduce the overall team performance towards your shared common goals. That's why this is important. And I'm super excited to be talking about this today. I'm curious about your thoughts. I'm not doing this just for my benefit. I'm using it for my PhD work, for my work, for a lot of other things. I'm curious to learn, how's your experience been with it? What are some other gaps, other experiences you've had, and what ways have you overcome them? Put it in a comment, put it on your place for posting on social media, and tag Leadership Daily. Hashtag Leadership Daily. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I really appreciate you listening in. Let me know what could be better. What did you like? And let's keep the conversation going. Thank you, everybody.